It's Levi Brackman here with Truth, Jewish Wisdom for Today. Thank you so much for joining. Before I begin, if you like this podcast, please subscribe, like it, leave a review wherever you listen to the podcasts, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's on Apple Podcasts, Audible, Spotify, wherever you listen to the podcast. Please leave a review or like it. That allows other people to also find this podcast. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's jump right in. Today is the final episode of the season about postmodernism, and I would like to do a recap and then also explain what the next season is going to be all about. So as a recap, I started this season delving into postmodernism as a result of the terrible attack that happened in October 2023 in Israel, where Hamas terrorists came in and they killed in the most brutal fashion, murdered, raped, mutilated, burnt alive people. And the result of that we saw as a reaction in the West and on university campuses, and the sheer silence about the sexual torture and assault against specifically women that seemingly people in the West just didn't care about and didn't respond to, and the fact that people blamed Israel right away, I started to delve into that and wonder why, what's going on? Why do we have this lack of moral clarity? And one of the things I came up with was this idea of the postmodern mindset that exists, where you have the oppressed versus the oppressor, the colonized versus the colonizer, etc. That narrative that exists within the postmodern mindset is what I consider to be a good part of why so many people in the West, not only do they hate themselves as being the West, but they also hate Israel. And this postmodern mindset and postmodernism was something that I felt I needed to delve into, and therefore I started a season on postmodernism. And from there we got into postmodernism and Judaism, and postmodern influence on Judaism as well. I have come to an understanding of what postmodernism is in a deeper way through this series, and I hope that you, my audience, who's followed me throughout this journey into postmodernism, has also gained a deeper understanding of postmodernism. One of the things that I've concluded is that postmodernism is, on the whole, a negative force. And at the very beginning of this season, I gave a history of postmodernism and went through the ideas that exist in the pre-modern era, and then the modern era, which one might also call the enlightenment, and then the postmodern era, which we live in at the moment. Some people consider us to be living in the postmodern era. And because I consider myself first and foremost to be a Judaic scholar, I have rabbinic ordinations and a master's degree in Hebrew and Jewish studies, and an undergrad degree in Hebrew and Jewish studies. So I've studied Judaism both in the yeshiva and also in the academy, and spent most of my life studying Judaism, although I also have a PhD in psychology. But I consider myself first and foremost to be a Judaic scholar, and therefore I've taken postmodernism from a Jewish perspective. But postmodernism also needs to be seen, as I've discussed, in a religious perspective, because it was religions that felt really threatened by modernism or by the Enlightenment, by the idea which suggests that we can use our intellect and we can use tools of science to understand the world around us and to gain the answers to big questions, was something which religious people felt was a real threat and would actually make them obsolete. And therefore they embraced the next thing, which was postmodernism, which ultimately ends up into this form of relativism, which for many of the religious people, that was fine, because it still said intellect and science doesn't get you everywhere, so there's room now for religion. I think what those religious people who were happy with postmodernism missed was that actually postmodernism has no respect really for anything besides itself. So what it does is it makes everything relative and therefore everything meaningless. Because if you don't stand for anything, you fall for everything in many ways. So nothing really has real value except for the postmodern ideology itself, which that guides you through everything. It's kind of really ironic idea that once you believe in postmodernism, the only thing which really has value is your postmodern ideas of relativism, but everything else is relative. So that's the issue with postmodernism, and therefore actually doesn't really do religion any favors at all. And my argument is that really it is the Enlightenment which is religion's best friend, and specifically Judaism, because within Judaism you have Enlightenment values. Because Judaism everywhere, all over the place, and I spent an entire episode explaining this, how Judaism is really all about looking at the evidence. Even God expected the Jewish people, when he was giving them the Torah on Mount Sinai, according to the story, to look at the evidence and to accept his Torah and accept God as their God, because he had provided them the evidence to show that this was the case. So the idea of a religion that claims that it is authentic and it is valid because of the evidence should feel no fear whatsoever from the evidence itself. And the fact that some of the forms of Judaism felt fear and therefore wanted to embrace postmodernism, I feel is problematic. So it seems to me that Judaism asks us to follow the evidence. Judaism is not afraid of the evidence. Judaism is a religion which is based on this idea that if you follow the evidence, you'll get closer to the correct beliefs and opinions. This is certainly something which Maimonides believed in, and it's certainly something which people like Yehuda Levi believed in, the author of the Kuzari. So these are things which Judaism, I think, really has in itself inherently. So because of that, I thought that as someone who's primarily a Judaic scholar, I would start on this podcast to teach Judaism with that frame. So I will teach Judaism with the idea of looking at the evidence and allow the evidence to take us to where the conclusion is. And the best way to do that, I felt, was to start studying the weekly Torah portion. In light of the conclusions that I've come to based on this podcast about postmodernism and how really Judaism is a more of an enlightenment religion and certainly not a postmodern religion, I thought it would be a good idea to study Judaism in the way that the Enlightenment would study it. And that is to look at the text, read it from an objective perspective, try and understand it from within the text itself without any bias, and then come to conclusions based on what is written in the text and other evidence of what the text is actually saying. And where better to start than the Torah itself, the 5 books of Moses, or the Hebrew Bible. And therefore, for the next series of my podcast, I'm going to be talking about each week the individual Torah portion. Now, it makes a lot of sense also because next week we start a brand new book, the book of Vayikra, Leviticus, and we're going to start Leviticus, and therefore, for the next year, every single week I'm challenging myself to come out with a new episode based on the weekly Torah portion. So for a whole year, we're going to have one season of the podcast. And that season is going to be the weekly Torah portion each week for the next year. And the approach that I'm going to take to reading the Torah portion is one based on Enlightenment values, based on the evidence and where the evidence takes us. Read it in an unbiased fashion. Try and understand what the text is trying to tell us in an unbiased fashion without looking at the Mefarshim, without looking at the commentators, and then looking at other kinds of evidence, perhaps bringing in some of the Mefarshim, but certainly looking at the texts in a critical fashion, and then trying to come up with what the text is actually trying to tell us, using the faculties of the intellect and evidence that is presented to us in various ways. So that's what I'm going to endeavor to do in the next season of the podcast, and the next season is going to last for an entire year. Again, I'm challenging myself to do one episode a week, scholarly take, an objective view on the Torah portion, and I hope that that will be something which people will enjoy. I'm fully well aware that there are plenty of podcasts out there on the Torah portion, And I'm also aware that this will probably have a very limited audience. And the small audience that I already have might shrink. But the idea here isn't to have a large audience. And that to back this up in the idea of limud HaTorah, studying the Torah, which is something which we as Jews do. All Jews, we're called the people of the book because we're obsessed with this book, the 5 books of Moses, and we're obsessed with studying the Torah. Everything is based on these 5 books of Moses, the Mishnah and the Talmud, the Zohar, everything is based on these 5 books of Moses. So we're obsessed with this one book, and this is what we do. We study the book. We do limud HaTorah. We study this Torah over and over and over and over again. So how should one study the Torah? So the Talmud has a very interesting story. The Talmud in Tractate Beitza, Daf Lamed Ches Amud Aleph, tells the following story. When Rabbi Abba went from Babylonia to the land of Israel, he said a prayer. And the prayer he said was as follows. Hey Rava, the Ema Milsot Tiskabel. May it be God's will that I should say something that should be accepted amongst my colleagues. So he wanted that the people of the land of Israel should find his teachings and his lectures that he's going to give there to be acceptable. So when he went up to the land of Israel, he found Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Chanina bar Papi, Rabbi Zera, and Rabbi Chanina bar Papi, and Rabbi Zera. But Amrila, and some people say that he wasn't Rabbi Chanina bar Papi and Rabbi Zera that he found there, but he found Rabbi Abahu, Rabbi Shimon Pazi, and Rabbi Yitzchak ben Afcha. And they were sitting, and they were saying something about a certain Mishnah. We won't get into the details of what they were saying. But Rabbi Abba came along, and he gave an answer. And what happened? These other rabbis laughed at him. So he said to him, Rabbi Abba said to them, Did I take your clothes away from you? Like, why are you laughing at me? Like, why would you do that? So they still laughed at him. And then Rabbi Yoshia said, Shape avud de achichu alai. He said it was good that they laughed at him. And this is a really strange piece of Talmud. A rabbi comes up from Babylonia, Rabbi Abba, and he's really excited about giving a lecture. He shows up in front of these rabbis from the land of Israel, and he gives his piece, he says his opinion, and they laugh at him. And he's like, why are you laughing at me? Did I do something to you? And they laugh at him further. And then another one of the rabbis, Rav Oshia, he says, well, it's good that they laughed at him. So what's going on here? Why are they so happy that they laughed at him? Why is it so appropriate that they laughed at Rabbi Abba? So the Chassam Sofer was, I would say, an anti-modernist. He was an anti-enlightenment figure for sure. But I would argue that perhaps he didn't really understand what the Enlightenment was in some ways. He understood the negative impact it was having on Judaism, but although he himself was an anti-Enlightenment figure, he also, I would argue, had within his viewpoint of the way he studied the values of the Enlightenment. And so does Judaism, in my opinion. And here is why. Because he explains why the sages in the land of Israel laughed at Rabbi Abba and felt it was appropriate to laugh at him in the following way. He says, because what did Rabbi Abba do? When he wanted to come up to the land of Israel, he gave out this prayer. He said, may it be God's will that my lectures be acceptable to the scholars in the land of Israel. Chassam Sofer points out that, 1 second, that's not how this works. There's actually a whole prayer called the prayer of Nechuni ben Akana, which one is supposed to say when one enters into the study hall in order to study Torah. And one of the things that it says that you should pray about in this prayer of Nechuni ben Akana is that you should... It's actually found at the beginning of each volume of the Schottenstein edition of the Art Scroll Talmud. You have this prayer. And the prayer says as follows, Hirasmo Fenecha, may it be the will in front of you, the Lord my God, Shaloi Ye'era Dvatakol al Yodi, that there shouldn't be any mistake occur through my hands, V'loi Ekashel B'dvar Halacha, and I shouldn't make a mistake in a word of Jewish law. And my friends should be happy with me. And I shouldn't say on something which is impure that it's pure, and not on something which is pure that it's impure. And my friends shouldn't also make a mistake in the word of Jewish law. And I should also be happy with my friends. So that is a standard prayer which is said. And if you analyze this prayer, what it is really saying here is that I should be able to analyze the situation, and specifically in light of the episode in which we discussed what it means to actually come to a conclusion in halakha. It involves properly and legitimately analyzing the circumstance that comes before you in the view and through the prism of the halakha, and then coming to a conclusion of what you should do as a result of how the halakha says, and therefore what should be the action, what should be the result, what should be the law in the view of how the halakha sees the action that must be taken based on the circumstances that exist. But one needs to be able to look at the actual events properly and analyze them correctly. And the halakha then tells you what to do once you've analyzed the events correctly. So what the prayer really is saying that I should be able to analyze the events correctly and then see through the lens and the prism of halakha what action should be taken. And then I should be able to say whether something is pure or impure, and that my friends should be happy with me if I do that correctly, and I should be happy with my friends because my friends will do that correctly. In other words, this whole of study, where I'm going to study now, should be a place where we're properly analyzing the circumstances, so we come to a legitimate and proper conclusion of what actually happened, and then we should be able to properly subject those circumstances through the prism of halakha, so we should come to the right conclusion based on what halakha says due to the circumstances that we have established. That is exactly what the prayer says. What was Rabbi Abba's prayer? Rabbi Abba's prayer was that he should say something that his friends should accept. 1 second, that's not the point of this. That's not the point of this at all, says Chassam Sofer. When you show up and the whole idea of what you want to do is in order that you should be popular, that your friends should like you, that your friends should like what you say, that's not Judaism. That's not the study of Torah. The study of Torah is to come to proper conclusions. And if you do that, your friends will be happy with you. It's not that you should first look for your friends to be happy with you. Because if you do that, the true scholars, the scholars of the land of Israel, they'll laugh at you. And rightly so, says Rabbi Yoshia. Rabbi Yoshia says it's rightly so to laugh at a person who shows up and talks because he wants to be popular and he wants his friends to accept what he has to say. That's laughable. What's not laughable is the serious study based on the evidence in order to come to the right conclusions. That's not laughable. That is limud HaTorah. That is what we pray to be able to do according to the prayer of Mechuni ben Akana as we go into the Beis Medrash each day in order to study Torah. So based on that, I want to study Torah on this podcast. So for the next 52 weeks or so, we're going to be studying Torah each and every single week based on the evidence, based on enlightenment values, which I believe are true Jewish Torah values of how to study Torah. And you might say, well, are there any other podcasts which do that? I don't know of them. I listen to a few Parsha podcasts each week. The Parsha podcasts of the Yeshiva in Gush Etzion are excellent, and I highly recommend them. There's one where you have conversations between two rabbis, Amnon Bazek and another rabbi, and then you also have one on the Ramban each week. They're excellent podcasts if you want to listen to those. I don't listen to a lot of Parsha podcasts, but those are two that I listen to almost every single week. So I don't know what the other Parsha podcasts are out there. I don't intend to turn this into a Parsha podcast, but over the next year, that's really what it will become. But I hope that it is a Parsha podcast which comes from a place of authenticity, which comes from a place of studying the texts in an unbiased way, just to try and figure out what's going on and then presenting that to you, my audience. So that is what we're going to be doing for the next number of weeks, starting from next week, the book of Leviticus, Parshas Vayikra, and I am very much looking forward to it. So thank you so much for joining me in this journey so far. I've really enjoyed talking about and studying and analyzing postmodernism, especially in light of the Jewish values that we have. And I'm going to enjoy just as much doing the podcast each week on the Torah portion. And I hope that you will join me for that as well. Meanwhile, this has been Levi Brackman with Truths, Jewish Wisdom for Today. And until next time.